Hi, I'm Tim Mosso, watch specialist, Govberg Jewelers.
And I'm Josh Srolovitz, senior watch buyer, Govberg Jewelers.
Today, we're going to take a little survey of the principal model lines of Rolex. Now, Rolex has produced many model lines over many decades, and what we have here is not exhaustive, but it comprises what I think we would both agree is the backbone of the Rolex sports watch lineup, which is to say, the backbone of Rolex.
Absolutely, and then the story all begins late 1950s with the introduction of Rolex's most staple watch, in my opinion, the Submariner. Here we have a 5508. It really is the great-grandfather to the Submariner that we have today. Small crown, no crown guards, just a really legible tool watch in every sense of the word. Moving down the line, we have the more probably preferred generation, 1680, with a red Submariner designation. These are very highly sought after. Also with this watch, you have crown guards. The case still 40 millimeters like the other, but it does prove to be a little bit more muscular, and of course a date indication.
And then we get into the transition era, where we start to see the move from watches designed expressly perhaps for specialists, divers, people involved in salvage and exploration to, dive watches built for the amateur and perhaps the desk diver in an office. So this is a reference 16800. It's known as a Transitional Submariner, and the 80s were the era of transitional Rolex. What you probably gleaned, though, from all of these watches is that the look of Rolex in its principal model lines does not change that much. The 1950s Submariner is still recognizable as a Submariner today in the case next to a contemporary reference. So for the most part, I think you'd agree that when you go older with pre-owned Rolex, you start to get into the realm of vintage. They're no longer pre-owned, they're true vintage.
Absolutely, and if you were to buy a watch that's either from the 1980s, the 1970s, or even from the 50s, you really are getting a very similar piece with slight cosmetic nuances and little details that maybe will only be known to you when it's on your wrist, and it just makes you smile when you put it on. And that's what these are all about.
Yeah, so really the lesson of looking at those three generations of Submariner is to realize that the watches we've chosen are backbone models for Rolex. They have been around for decades. Rolex, established originally as Wilsdorf and Davis in 1905, has been around for far over a century, and the watches we're looking at, for the most part, have been with Rolex for at least half of that story.
Absolutely, and when Rolex introduced the Oyster case in 1926, what you see here is the product of that invention. All these watches have Oyster cases, provide a truly spectacular level of water resistance, which is a staple in their collection to this day.
Now the other thing that we want to mention is that the Submariner may be Rolex's best known dive watch, perhaps its iconic diver, but it's not its only diver by any means. Now what I have here is what's known as a 666 Sea Dweller, and just as I mentioned that there are transitional era Submariners, so are there transitional era Sea Dwellers. The Sea Dweller different because it's thicker, it's rated to a deeper depth in all of its versions, and as you can see, there's a helium escape valve on the side. It was originally built as a professional diving instrument, not so much for the pro-am like the Sub, but for true hardcore gas exploration, oil drillers, wreckers, people who went down in diving bells.
It's very cool to see the newest iteration of this watch, the Sea Dweller 4000. It's an incredible homage to the 16660. What you're going to see is an updated case with a little bit more muscular characteristics. Of course, that beautiful Serrachrome bezel and the maxi dial. It's a winner.
Yeah, I mean, on a watch like this, here's the thing about Rolex. While the look of the watches doesn't change, in a lot of cases, the technical capabilities do change quite a bit. So with the Sea Dweller 4000, what we have is a much more robust watch with a deeper depth rating, but also things like a ceramic bezel. In the modern era, that's something you see on most Rolex sports watches today.
And it really is a nice touch. Those aluminum bezels are beautiful. I love them. The beauty of the Serrachrome bezel is that it is nearly impossible to scratch or cause any blemish to it, and it shines beautifully. They're fantastic pieces.
Yeah, the other thing is that I think you and I will both be able to relate what can't be felt through the camera, but it's the change in the bracelets that distinguishes older Rolex from current, perhaps more than anything else.
Absolutely. These newer references with the solid link bracelets really do add a considerable weight to the watch, and it's in no way overbearing, but it's just a little added presence that you feel on the wrist, and it just feels like such a well-made piece of machinery and artwork. They're very well executed.
Everything from sliders to dive fold-outs, and that's really one of the primary benefits of going with a newer pre-owned Rolex. You're going to get more of the bells and whistles that are currently in the catalog. So just as a sub was Rolex's first dive watch, the Sea Dweller remains its ultimate dive watch. To go a little bit closer to the wave tops and sports above the surface, we have the Yacht-Master 2, which debuted in 1992.
Absolutely, and this watch, catered maybe towards the the watch aficionado who was on a sailboat, racing in a regatta. Something a little bit more luxurious, not quite as strenuous as deep sea diving. Of course, this watch is more than suitable for water wear. What you have, which is very unique, is a platinum bezel in addition to a platinum dial, which has some lovely texture to it. It's something really unique in the Rolex catalog.
Also important to note, a couple of changes to the Yacht-Master versus the Submariner. Of course, having the precious metal bezel insert rather than anodized aluminum back at that time was a big deal. Also, the dials featuring larger luminescent plots, what would eventually come to be known as the maxi dial in Rolex parlance. Plus, not just that, but certain refinements that you don't see on Submariners, like in this case, the dial of the watch is actually granular platinum. So, the Yacht-Master, water resistant to 100 meters with a bi-directional rotating bezel, a little bit more luxurious than the Sub, doesn't dive quite as deep, but more indicative of Rolex's move in the early 90s into the luxury sphere.
Absolutely, you could see that furthermore in the high polished parts of the watch. The center links are shiny, which adds a little bit of class to it, in addition to the lugs, which from the top are high polished as well. Just a little bit of more luxurious look and feel to the watch.
And certainly, the Yacht-Master came into its own during the 90s when Rolex was known for luxury and had become a household name that sort of, as we always say, transcends the industry. But the Daytona, although it had been around since the early 60s, also came into its own toward the end of the 80s and the early 90s with the debut of the automatic 40mm watch.
Absolutely, and at the time that was one of the few, if only, Rolex watches that was being manufactured and sold without housing a Rolex movement. What we had in those original late 80s through early 2000 Rolex's Daytonas were the Zenith El Primera movement. Those are still easy to find today. They're very special to collectors and for a reason. But these newer versions with in-house Rolex movement, just truly a workhorse of a watch, will not let you down.
Yeah, I mean, with the Daytona, it's basically the 1963 to 1987 watches, which are manual wind, about 39 millimeters. They were not popular when they were new. And then from 1988 to the present, all of a sudden, the Daytona's transformed. First with the 40mm watch with the sapphire crystal, automatic winding with the El Primero movement, the metal tachymetric scale bezel. And then in 2000, there's the second stage, the same look of the watch, but now with an in-house caliber, a 3-day power reserve. And, I think for 2016, while changing very little aesthetically, the small refinement of a ceramic bezel has given the watch yet another gear.
Yeah, it's a completely new piece. For 16 years or so, we had this all stainless steel Daytona with a beautiful stainless steel bezel. Obviously, another transcendent piece. The Serichrome bezel in this watch kind of keeps in line with what they're going for with these new bezels, different materials. And although it's very similar to its predecessor, it's a completely new watch, and it's been extraordinarily well received.
So just as the Submariner was for all divers, pro and am, the Sea Dweller was for professional divers. The Yacht-Master was for sportsmen of an aquatic bent, but not necessarily scuba divers. The Daytona, I think, even in its early days, just go back to its namesake, the Daytona Motor Speedway. It is a motorsports-themed watch for fans and racers alike.
Absolutely, and in keeping in line with catering watches to professionals of demanding industries, we move on next to the GMT Master, which of course was designed to display dual time zone, very helpful to pilots, traveling across different time zones. And these watches allowed the wearer to easily track, 2, and if you use the bezel properly, maybe 3 time zones in a really efficient manner.
Yeah, and the thing about the watch originally was that it was commissioned by Pan Am. It was released for pilots, and the idea was that you would set the time to Greenwich Mean Time. So GMT, the predecessor to Universal Time, but the watch had only one time zone in its original version. The GMT Master had a 24-hour hand that gave you AM/PM distinction, but you had to use the bezel to offset as per your local airfield and your local time zone to find out what the time was locally. So the watch always showed GMT, and then you offset to your local time. Now in the early 80s with the Master 2, that all changed.
Correct. On the GMT Master 2, we gained another source of functionality wherein we could independently set the home time and travel time, if you will. You know where you are and you know where you're from, and you can just do that with the second position in the crown really easily to any time zone that you see fit. And that was just the next step in the GMT Master history.